"You're fired," was shouted, and the story began. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed like a swarm of angry hornets, flickering erratically and casting jagged, menacing shadows across the chipped linoleum floor. Megan Parker scrubbed the counter with a rag that reeked of bleach and faded dreams, her hands trembling from a bone-deep exhaustion that clung to her like damp rot. It was 11:47 p.m. at Sam's Deer, a dilapidated roadside shack teetering on the edge of a forgotten town, its peeling paint and cracked windows a testament to years of neglect. The clock's sluggish hands mocked her relentlessly, each tick a cruel reminder of the 12-hour shift she'd endured. Her sneakers soaked through from a spilled Coke that had pooled under the register, her apron a canvas of grease stains and quiet desperation. The night had crawled by with agonizing slowness, offering only a handful of customers. A trucker who'd tossed a measly dime onto the counter with a grunt, a drunk who'd stumbled in and vomited in the corner booth before staggering back into the dark, and an old woman who'd stared silently at her coffee for an hour before leaving nothing but a crumpled napkin. Rent loomed like a guillotine blade, due in 6 merciless days, and Amy's savings, a pitiful $47 stuffed into a rusted coffee can under her sink, wouldn't even slow its descent. She was 28, single, and drowning in a life that felt like quicksand, every frantic step pulling her deeper into a suffocating abyss she couldn't escape. The bell above the door screeched, a shrill, violent sound that shattered the oppressive silence and jolted Amy from her spiraling thoughts. Her head snapped up, hazel eyes narrowing against the blinding glare of headlights slicing through the diner's grimy, fingerprint-smeared windows. A man stood framed in the threshold, his silhouette swallowed by the inky blackness of the night beyond. He was tall and gaunt, his frame swallowed by a coat that hung off him like a tattered shroud, threadbare, patched with strips of duct tape, the kind of garment you'd fish out of a dumpster behind a derelict gas station. Dust clung to his scuffed boots, each hesitant step grinding grit into the floor with a faint crunch that echoed in the stillness. His hair was a wild, matted tangle streaked with gray, whipping slightly in the draft from the open door, and his face, God, his face, was a battlefield of scars and sorrow, etched with lines so deep they seemed carved by years of unrelenting pain. His eyes were sunken, twin hollows that glinted faintly in the dim light, carrying a weight that made Amy's stomach twist into a knot of unease. He moved with a quiet, broken dignity, shoulders slumped as if the world had spent decades hammering him into submission, each blow leaving an invisible bruise she could almost feel. He stopped at the counter, his shadow stretching long and ominous across the scratched formica, pooling like spilled ink. His hands, rough, calloused, trembling with a faint tremor, delved into a pocket and emerged clutching a fistful of crumpled bills, their edges frayed and dirty, the kind you'd scrape from the bottom of a rusted toolbox or find wedged under a couch cushion after months of neglect. He smoothed them out with slow, deliberate care, his fingers shaking as if these few dollars were the last fragile thread tethering him to dignity. "Excuse me, miss," he rasped, his voice a gravelly whisper, raw and cracked from too many nights spent shivering in the cold, too many days without a kind word. "What can I get for $5?" The question hung in the air, heavy with a shame he couldn't mask, a vulnerability that pierced through the diner's stale atmosphere and lodged itself in Amy's chest like a shard of glass. She glanced at the menu board behind her, faded ink curling at the edges, the cheapest item a meager $8 burger that mocked his meager offering. $5 wouldn't even buy a stale coffee and a whispered prayer in this place, let alone a meal to fill the hollow ache she could see in his frame. She chewed her lip, her mind racing like a runaway train hurtling toward a cliff. She could send him away, watch him shuffle back into the freezing night, his hunger a silent scream no one else would hear. It'd be easy, safe, the kind of choice Carl, the diner's manager, would demand with his sneering, petty tyranny. Or she could do something reckless, something dangerous that could unravel the fragile threads of her already unraveling life. Her gaze flicked back to those eyes, haunted, hollow, yet flickering with a spark she couldn't ignore. Was it pride, clinging to the wreckage of who he'd once been? Pain, etched into every line of his weathered face? Or hope, a faint ember buried deep beneath the ashes of a life she couldn't begin to imagine? It clawed at her, a jagged hook sinking into her ribs and tugging hard. She thought of her mom. Gone 3 years now, her voice echoing through the years. You don't turn away a soul in need, Amy. Not ever. She thought of the eviction notice pinned to her fridge with a magnet shaped like a sunflower. Its cheerful yellow was a cruel joke against the red-stamped, final warning. She thought of Carl, a mean-spirited bastard with a temper like a rattlesnake who'd fire her faster than she could blink if he caught her bending the rules. Maybe even tonight if he stormed out of his office with that familiar scowl. But those eyes, they pinned her in place, daring her to be human when every instinct screamed at her to look away, to protect the crumbling walls of her own survival. You're in luck, she said, forcing a smile that trembled at the edges, her voice quivering like a tightrope walker on a fraying line. We've got a special tonight. 1 full meal for $5. His brows shot up, surprise flashing across his scarred face like a lightning bolt in a storm. Really? He croaked, the word laced with disbelief, as if kindness were a foreign language he hadn't heard in years. Really? She said, her heart hammering against her ribs as she punched the order into the register. Chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes slathered in gravy, a roll still warm from the oven, the works. She'd cover the difference herself and dip into that meager $47 she'd stashed away. Consequences be damned. Carl could shove it up his ass for all she cared. The cook, Tony, a grizzled old-timer with a perpetual cigarette dangling from his lips, raised a bushy eyebrow from the kitchen but said nothing, flipping the steak onto the grill with a sizzle that cut through the tension like a knife. Minutes ticked by, each one a taut wire stretching Amy's nerves to the breaking point. She slid the steaming plate in front of him, the aroma of hot food curling up like a fragile promise, filling the air with a warmth that felt dangerously out of place. For a split second, his mask cracked, a faint, grateful smile tugging at his cracked lips, a glimmer of humanity breaking through the wreckage. You didn't have to do this, he murmured, his voice thick with something raw. Gratitude, maybe, or a grief too deep to name. It wrapped around Amy's throat and squeezed. She shrugged, playing it off with a casualness she didn't feel. Everyone deserves a warm meal, but inside, she was a churning storm, fear and defiance warring in her gut, twisting her insides into knots. She just gambled her last shred of stability on a stranger, a man who could be anyone, a drifter, a con, a ghost, and the weight of it crashed over her like a tidal wave threatening to pull her under. Then the storm broke. Amy! Carl's voice sliced through the diner like a machete through flesh, sharp and venomous, dripping with a rage that made the air turn sour. He stormed out from the back, his greasy polo shirt stretched tight over his beer gut, his face twisted into a snarl that bared yellowed teeth. What the hell are you doing? He barked, his beady eyes zeroing in on the plate like a hawk spotting prey. Amy's pulse skyrocketed, her hands clenching into fists behind the counter, nails digging into her palms until she felt the sting of blood. I paid for it myself, she said, forcing her voice to stay steady even as her knees trembled beneath her. Carl's laugh was a guttural, mocking thing, a sound that slithered down her spine and coiled there. We're not a damn soup kitchen, Walker. You want to play Mother Teresa? Do it on your own dime. Somewhere else, not in my diner. His words were a barrage, each one a slap across her face, stinging with contempt. He's a veteran, she shot back, her voice rising despite the tremor threading through it, defiance flaring hot and bright in her chest. Carl's eyes rolled so hard she thought they'd pop out of his skull, his sneer deepening into something uglier. Not my problem. What's next? You gonna start feeding every filthy bum who staggers off the street? Before she could fire back, he lunged forward, snatched the plate from the counter with a meaty hand, and hurled it into the trash. The crash of ceramic shattering against metal rang out like a gunshot, the wet splat of food hitting the bin a sickening echo that turned Amy's stomach. Gravy oozed down the side of the can, a slow, grotesque slide that mirrored the dread pooling in her gut. The veteran didn't move, his hands resting limp in his lap, his face a blank slate of resignation that cut deeper than any words could. Carl dusted his hands off, smirking like he'd just crushed a roach under his boot. "Now get back to work, or you're done." Her blood turned to molten fire, surging through her veins with a fury she couldn't contain. "You're a disgrace," she hissed, the words spilling out like venom before she could stop them, each syllable a dagger aimed at his smug face. Carl's smirk widened, a predator sizing up wounded prey, his eyes glinting with malice. "And you're fired." The air sucked out of the room, leaving a vacuum that swallowed her whole. She blinked, her mind reeling as the words slammed into her like a sledgehammer. "What?" she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "You heard me?" he sneered, crossing his arms over his chest, his stance wide and unyielding. "Grab your crap and get the hell out of my diner." The room spun around her, Tony staring wide-eyed from the kitchen, the lone trucker in the corner gawking with his mouth half open, the veteran's silent presence a weight pressing down on her chest. She wanted to scream, to lunge across the counter and claw that smug look off Carl's face, to smash something, anything, to release the rage boiling inside her. But all she could do was stand there, drowning in the wreckage of her own reckless, beautiful defiance, the pieces of her life scattering like the shards of that broken plate. Amy stumbled out into the frigid night, the diner's door slamming shut behind her with a clang that reverberated in her bones like a death knell. The wind howled down the empty street, a vicious, biting thing that clawed at her exposed skin, carrying the acrid stench of diesel fumes and the faint rot of a town left to decay. Her coat hung loose over her shoulders, threadbare and useless against the cold that seeped into her marrow, turning her breath into shaky, fleeting clouds that dissolved into the darkness. Each puff was a silent scream she couldn't release, desperate plea swallowed by the void. "Fired." The word ricocheted through her skull, a relentless bullet tearing through every fragile hope she'd clung to with bloodied, trembling hands. No job, no money, no way to pay the rent that loomed over her like a guillotine, its blade glinting with the promise of ruin. She'd torched her entire life for a stranger's meal, a reckless, stupid, $12 act of kindness. And now she was the one starving, not just for food but for answers, for a lifeline, for anything to make sense of the chaos that had swallowed her whole in the span of a single shattering moment. The half-mile walk home stretched into an eternity of torment, her sneakers slapping the cracked pavement in a frantic rhythm that synced with the wild thudding of her heart. The street lights flickered overhead, their weak, jaundiced glow casting long, distorted shadows that danced mockingly around her, as if the town itself were laughing at her downfall. What had she done? The question gnawed at her, sharp and relentless, a feral thing with teeth that sank deep into her mind and refused to let go. She saw the veteran's face in her memory, those hollow, haunted eyes, that fleeting, grateful smile that had pierced her like an arrow, and felt a stab of something she couldn't name, a tangled mess of emotions churning in her gut. Was it guilt for dragging him into this disaster? Pride for standing up when no one else would? Or fury, a blazing inferno that roared against Carl, against the world, against herself for daring to care when caring had only ever left her bruised and bleeding? She'd wanted to help, to prove she wasn't just another faceless cog in Carl's miserable, grease-stained machine. But now she was nothing. No title, no purpose, just a ghost drifting through a town that didn't give a damn whether she lived or died. Her apartment loomed ahead, a sagging Carl box with peeling paint and a busted porch light that buzzed faintly, a pitiful sentinel against the encroaching night. She fumbled with her keys, her fingers numb and clumsy from the cold, and shoved the door open with a creak that sounded like a groan of surrender. Inside, the air was stale and thick, heavy with the ghosts of unpaid bills, unwashed dishes piled in the sink, and the faint mildew scent of a life unraveling at the seams. She tossed her coat over a Carlity chair, the fabric catching on a splintered edge, and collapsed onto the bed, the springs groaning under her weight like they too were tired of holding her up. The stack of envelopes on the table glared at her through the dim light. Rent, electricity, a credit card she'd maxed out months ago on a busted water heater, each one a ticking bomb waiting to detonate. She buried her face in her hands, her breath hitching as the dam she'd built around her emotions cracked and shattered. Tears burned her cheeks, hot and bitter, streaming down her face in silent, unstoppable rivers. She'd lost everything: her job, her stability, her fragile grip on survival. For a meal she couldn't even afford to give. Carl's smirk flashed in her mind, his cruel, guttural laugh ringing in her ears like a taunt she couldn't escape. She hated him, hated his petty, tyrannical reign over the diner, his cold indifference that turned people into numbers, his smug certainty that he held all the power. But more than that, she hated herself, for caring when no one else did, for risking it all on a stranger's fleeting gratitude, for believing, even for a moment, that one small act could matter in a world this rotten, this unforgiving. Sleep was a cruel mirage, dancing just out of reach as the night stretched into an endless purgatory. She tossed and turned, the thin blanket tangling around her legs, her mind replaying the scene in a relentless loop. The veteran's quiet thank you that had warmed her for a fleeting second, the plate smashing into the trash with a sound that still echoed in her skull, Carl's venomous "you're fired" that had ripped her world apart. She saw her mom's face too, soft and worn from years of scraping by, her voice whispering through the haze of memory. "You don't turn away a soul in need, Amy. Not ever." Amy had believed that once, back when she was a wide-eyed kid who thought goodness paid off, who thought the world rewarded courage with something other than a kick in the teeth. Now it felt like a fairy tale, a naive lie she'd been stupid enough to swallow whole. By dawn, exhaustion finally dragged her under, but her dreams were a battlefield. Carl's sneer morphing into her landlord's impatient glare, the veteran's face fading into a shadow she couldn't reach, her own voice screaming into a void that swallowed every sound and spat back silence. Morning arrived, gray and merciless, the sky outside her cracked window a slab of concrete pressing down on the town. Amy dragged herself out of bed, her body aching like she'd been run over by a semi, every muscle protesting as she forced herself upright. She pulled on her warmest coat, a thrift store find with a torn sleeve and a zipper that stuck halfway, and stepped outside, the cold biting at her exposed skin like a swarm of invisible wasps. Job hunting was her only shot now, a desperate, clawing scramble to salvage some shred of control from the wreckage. She hit every shop on Main Street, gas stations with flickering signs, cafes with chipped mugs and surly waitresses, even the dingy bar where the stools were sticky with spilled beer and the air reeked of regret. "Not hiring," they all said, their voices flat and mechanical, their eyes sliding past her like she was a phantom they couldn't be bothered to see. By noon, her feet throbbed in her soaked sneakers, her stomach growled with a hunger she couldn't appease, and her hope was a frayed thread stretched to the snapping point. She found herself back near Sam's Deer, the neon sign buzzing like a taunt, its garish red glow a slap across her bruised pride. She didn't mean to stop. God knows she wanted to keep walking, to leave that hellhole behind forever, but her legs betrayed her, rooting her across the street as memories flooded back in a torrent she couldn't dam. Then the earth trembled beneath her feet. A low, guttural rumble rolled through the air, vibrating up her spine and jolting her from her haze. She turned, her breath catching in her throat as a military convoy roared into view. Jeeps painted in drab green, armored trucks bristling with steel, a beastly line of machinery tearing down the quiet road like an invading army. Dust billowed in their wake, a choking cloud that stung her eyes, tires chewing pavement with a growl that drowned out the town's usual hum. People spilled out of shops, jaws slack, phones raised to capture the spectacle as the convoy slowed, engines snarling like caged predators, and stopped dead in front of Sam's Deer, their hulking forms casting long, ominous shadows across the faded facade. Amy's heart slammed against her ribs, a wild, erratic drumbeat that drowned out the world. What the hell was this? A raid? A mistake? Her mind raced, panic and curiosity warring as she edged closer, her sneakers scuffing the curb. Inside, Carl was wiping down a table with a rag as filthy as his attitude, smug as ever, his kingdom of grease and grime undisturbed by the chaos he'd wrought the night before. He'd probably slept like a baby, secure in his petty dominion, his conscience as clean as the diner's stained floors, which is to say, not at all. The bell jingled, once, twice, then a dozen times in rapid succession, and he straightened, expecting some late-lunch straggler too broke to tip. Instead, a wall of a man strode in, his dress uniform crisp and imposing, metals glinting like shards of sunlight caught in a storm. David Morgan, his name tag red, his jaw set like granite, his eyes sharp enough to cut glass. Behind him marched a squad of Marines, their combat boots thudding against the linoleum in perfect, unyielding unison, faces carved from stone and etched with a quiet, lethal resolve. The diner went graveyard quiet, forks frozen mid-bite, Carl's rag slipping from his meaty hand to land with a soft thud on the table. "Can I help you?" he stammered, his bravado crumbling under the weight of their stares, his voice a thin, reedy thing that betrayed the sweat beading on his brow. "We're looking for Megan Parker," Carter said, his voice a deep, unyielding command that rolled through the room like thunder, shaking the cheap light fixtures overhead. Carl blinked, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard, his hands twitching at his sides. She doesn't work here anymore," he managed, the words stumbling out like a confession he hadn't meant to give. "We know," Carter replied, his eyes cutting through the room like a blade, slicing through Carl's flimsy defenses without effort. The door swung open again, and Amy's breath snagged in her chest, a sharp, painful hitch that made her dizzy. It was him, the veteran, but transformed beyond recognition. Henry Mitchell stood tall in a Marine dress uniform, ribbons pinned to his chest in a proud cascade of color. His gaze steady and fierce, a fire burning where yesterday there'd been only ashes. Carl's jaw tightened, his face paling as recognition hit. "Henry?" he croaked, but Henry ignored him entirely, turning to Carter with a nod. "This is Colonel Carter," he said, his voice ringing with a quiet, unshakable power that filled the room. "And these are my brothers." Amy's mind spun, a kaleidoscope of confusion, adrenaline, and a dawning awe that made her knees weak. She edged closer to the diner's window, peering through the smudged glass as Henry spoke again, his words carrying a weight that pressed against her chest. "Yesterday, a woman showed me kindness when no one else would. She lost her job for it, because of him." He jerked his head toward Carl, who flinched as if struck. Carter stepped forward, his presence a thunderclap that silenced even the hum of the diner's ancient fridge. "Henry Mitchell isn't just any veteran. He's a war hero. Saved dozens of my men in combat, pulled them from hellfire when the odds said they were already dead. The way he was treated here? Unacceptable." Carl's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles whitening, his face draining of color until he looked like a corpse propped upright. "I didn't know," he started, his voice a weak, pleading thing, but Henry cut him off with a single searing word. "You didn't care." Carter's gaze shifted, locking onto Amy through the window with an intensity that froze her blood. "Megan Parker," he called, his voice carrying over the low growl of idling engines outside, steady and firm, laced with a respect she hadn't heard in years, maybe ever. Her heart stuttered, every head in the diner swiveling to pin her in place, their stares a mix of shock, curiosity, and something she couldn't name. She wanted to run, to vanish into the crowd and let the earth swallow her whole, but her feet moved on their own, drawn by something in Carter's tone. Unyielding, commanding, yet threaded with a warmth that pulled her forward like a lifeline. She stepped inside, the diner's stale warmth clashing with the icy dread in her veins, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the floor. Carl stared at her, his face a mask of shock and dawning dread, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping on dry land. Carter's lips twitched into a faint, approving smile that softened the hard lines of his face. "Miss Walker, we heard what happened last night. More importantly, we heard what you did for Henry." Her throat closed up, words failing her as her eyes flicked to Henry, who met her gaze with a small, steady nod. A silent thank you that hit her like a punch to the gut. Carter continued, his voice low but resonant, filling the room with a gravity that made the walls seem to lean in. "We need people like you, people with guts, with hearts who do what's right even when it costs them everything. We're offering you a job." Her breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound that broke the silence. "A job?" she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper, her mind struggling to catch up. "Not enlistment," he clarified, his tone patient but firm. "A program for veterans, counseling, job placement, community support, helping men like Henry rebuild their lives from the ground up. You'd be perfect for it." Her head reeled, the world tilting under her feet. Yesterday, she'd been a nobody, a waitress scraping by on tips and stubbornness. Now, the United States Marine Corps was handing her a lifeline. A chance to be something more? Carl's scoff shattered the moment, a harsh, grating sound that scraped against the tension like nails on a chalkboard. "You're kidding me, right? She's a waitress. A nobody. You can't seriously think she's cut out for some fancy vet program." His voice was shrill, edged with panic, but Carter's eyes turned glacial, his stare pinning Carl like a bug under glass. "She did more for one of our own in a single night than you'll do in your entire miserable life," he said, each word a hammer strike that drove Carl's bravado into the dirt. The room held its breath, tension crackling like static before a storm, every eye darting between the colonel, the cowering manager, and the woman caught in the eye of it all. Amy clutched the business card Carter pressed into her hand, her pulse a war drum pounding in her ears, her fingers trembling around the stiff paper. She'd lost it all, her job, her stability, her pride. And now, in the span of a heartbeat, she'd been offered a chance to rise from the ashes, to build something new from the rubble of her old life. Amy stood frozen in the diner's center, the air thick with the weight of a dozen stairs. Colonel Carter's business card a lifeline burning between her shaking fingers. The past 24 hours crashed over her like a tidal wave. Fear that had clawed at her throat as she'd walked home jobless, fury that had scorched her veins at Carl's cruelty, despair that had pressed her into her lumpy mattress all night, and now this fragile, flickering thing called hope that glowed faintly in her chest. She glanced at Henry, his Marine uniform a testament to battles fought and won, his scars a map of sacrifice she could barely fathom. His nod was small but steady, a silent vow that she wasn't alone in this strange, surreal moment. Carl's dry, humorless laugh grated against the silence, a desperate attempt to claw back control. "This is insane," he sneered, shaking his head, his voice cracking at the edges. "You think she's qualified for some fancy vet program? She's nothing. Just a washed-up waitress with a bleeding heart." Carter didn't flinch, his gaze a cold, unyielding blade that cut through Carl's bravado like butter. "She's more than you'll ever be, Hudson," he said, his words a quiet thunder that rolled through the room, leaving Carl shrinking in its wake. Amy's chest swelled, a spark of defiance reigniting deep within her, a fire that whispered, "I'm not nothing. Not anymore." She walked out into the crisp evening, the convoy's engines fading into a distant growl as the Marines dispersed, leaving her alone with the card and a choice that weighed heavier than the world on her shoulders. That night, she didn't sleep. She wrestled with it, pacing her cramped apartment in endless circles, her sneakers scuffing the worn floorboards. The stack of bills on the table loomed like a jury, their red stamps glaring accusations. "You can't afford this. You're not enough." Could she do this? Leave behind the diner, the only life she'd ever known. A grimy, thankless existence of wiping counters and dodging Carl's temper. For something bigger, something unknown? She thought of her mom, her soft voice echoing through the years, urging her to help, to care. She thought of Henry, a man who'd walked in with nothing but $5 and a lifetime of pain, and how her one reckless act had brought a military convoy to her doorstep. By morning, as the first gray light seeped through her cracked blinds, she knew. She pulled on her coat, squared her shoulders, and showed up at the address on the card. A modest office buzzing with purpose, its walls lined with photos of veterans smiling, rebuilding, and living. Carter greeted her with a handshake that steadied her trembling hands, his grip firm and warm. "Welcome aboard," he said, and for the first time in years, maybe ever, Amy felt like she belonged somewhere that mattered. 6 months later, she sat in her office at the Veteran Transition Program, a cluttered desk stacked with files, a chipped mug of coffee cooling beside her, and a purpose pumping through her veins like lifeblood. The job had changed her, taught her to navigate the labyrinth of bureaucracy with a tenacity she didn't know she had, to listen to stories of war and loss with an empathy that sometimes left her raw, to fight tooth and nail for men and women the world had discarded like yesterday's trash. Henry was there often, a steady, grounding presence. His own life rebuilt by painstaking Carl. He traded his tattered coat for a collared shirt with the program's logo, his hair trimmed, and his posture tall and proud. One evening, as the center's first community event hummed around them, veterans laughing over folding tables, recruiters shaking hands, families reconnecting in a room alive with chatter, he pulled her aside near the entrance. From his pocket, he drew that worn $5 bill, its edges frayed and soft from months of being carried, a relic of the night that had changed everything. "Kept it?" he said, his voice rough with emotion, his eyes glinting with something soft and fierce. "That night I was invisible, less than nothing. You saw me, Amy. You gave me back something I'd lost." Tears stung her eyes, hot and sudden, blurring his face into a watercolor smear. "Henry," she started, but her voice broke. He clapped her shoulder, a firm, brotherly gesture. "You didn't just save me. You saved yourself too." She held that bill in her hands, its texture rough against her fingertips, a tear slipping free to splash onto the faded ink. She felt the truth of his words settle into her bones. One meal, a reckless, stupid, beautiful act born of a stubborn heart, had set off a chain reaction that still rippled outward. It had toppled Carl's petty empire, leaving him a footnote in a story he couldn't control. It had lifted Henry from the shadows, giving him a second chance to stand tall among his brothers. And it had pulled Amy from the quicksand of her old life, a life of scraping by and swallowing her pride, into something new, a role where she wasn't just surviving but building, bridging, and healing. She wasn't just a waitress anymore, a faceless figure in a stained apron. She was a voice, a hand reaching out, a spark igniting lives the world had forgotten. As she watched the event unfold, veterans finding jobs, kids hugging parents they hadn't seen smile in years, she knew this was only the beginning, a single thread in a tapestry she'd keep weaving as long as she had breath. Here's the lesson, raw and real, stripped down to its bones. Kindness isn't weak. It's a weapon, a spark that can burn down walls and light up the darkest corners. Amy didn't have much that night, just a few bucks and a heart too stubborn to quit. But she used them, and look what happened. Carl thought he'd won, tossing that plate into the trash like it was garbage, smirking as he fired her into the night. But he didn't see the convoy coming, didn't hear the growl of engines or felt the weight of Henry's brothers storming through his door. He didn't see Amy's courage, or the ripple that one meal sent crashing through their lives, reshaping them in ways he'd never grasped. In a world that loves to kick you when you're down, compassion can feel like swimming upstream, gasping for air while the current drags you back. But it's worth it, worth every bruise, every risk, because sometimes that single act, the one nobody notices at first, changes everything. It's not about grand gestures or Hollywood endings. It's about the quiet, messy human choice to care when it's easier to walk away. So here's where you come in right now in this moment. Think about it. Who's the invisible person in your life? The guy on the corner with the cardboard sign, his eyes averted? The coworker who sits alone at lunch, silent and small? The neighbor whose porch light hasn't flickered on in weeks? What's your $5 meal? The small, crazy, reckless thing you could do to say, "I see you, and you matter"? Maybe it's a coffee handed over with a smile, a conversation struck up when silence would be simpler, a stand against some petty Carl in your own world who thinks kindness is weakness. It doesn't have to be big. It just has to be real, a spark you strike because you can. And when you do it, tell us. Have a story to share? Drop it in the comments below. And if you love heartwarming tales that touch the soul, don't forget to like and subscribe to Daily Narrated Stories, where every story leaves a lasting impression. Let us know how it felt to light that fire, to feel the warmth of it spread. Because Amy's story isn't just hers. It's ours, yours, and mine. It's proof that the tiniest ripple can turn into a tidal wave, washing away the junk, the apathy, the cynicism, and leaving something better, stronger, truer in its place. Amy folded that $5 bill into her pocket, a talisman of the night she chose to fight when running would have been safer. She didn't know then that it'd lead her here, surrounded by people she'd helped stand up, people who'd helped her stand taller, a community stitched together by threads of grit, grace, and a refusal to give up. She'd been scared that night, broke and lost, her life a pile of ashes after Carl's final sneer. But she dared to care, dared to bet on a stranger's worth when the world bet against her. And that bet had paid off in ways she couldn't have dreamed. That's the magic of it, the messy, beautiful human truth. Our actions matter. Not tomorrow, not in some grand cinematic sweep, but right now in the quiet choices that define who we are, who we can be. So go out there. Be reckless with your kindness, wild with your compassion. Change a life, maybe your own, and let's keep this wave rolling, one soul, one spark, one stubbornly beating heart at a time.